Beatrice and Princess Eugenie in royal circles, and you'll often hear praise for their grounded nature. That contrast becomes even sharper when laid against their father, whose behavior over the years has been described as crude, entitled, and juvenile. The disparity between Andrew and his daughters is striking and revealing. How does someone raised in the same environment chart such a drastically different course? If you love getting the real story behind the palace walls, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and tap the notification bell so you never miss an update. The answer, according to those closest to him, lies not in upbringing alone, but in character. Unlike his daughters, Andrew embraced the perks without the pressure, choosing recklessness over responsibility time and time again. What emerges isn't just a family dynamic, but a case study in personal accountability, or the lack of it. His daughter's poise highlights how much of Andrew's downfall stems not from royal blood, but from choices made and lines crossed. As insiders and ex-partners recount decades of misbehavior, from boundary pushing at parties to acts of public embarrassment, the contrast becomes a mirror. It reflects what could have been and what was willingly discarded in favor of self-interest. Andrew Mountbatten Windsor didn't just wake up one day and find himself disgraced. This wasn't an overnight scandal or a single misstep. It was a slow, predictable unraveling of a man whose entire life had been built on the belief that consequences didn't apply to him. If you love getting the real story behind the palace walls, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and tap the notification bell so you never miss an update. And now, with former girlfriends and insiders finally speaking out, that belief system has been exposed for exactly what it was: dangerous, arrogant, and entirely unsustainable. What's coming to light through these accounts isn't some shocking twist. It's a confirmation. The behavior, the entitlement, the way Andrew carried himself, it's all been part of a consistent pattern. From royal staff to romantic partners, the stories echo the same flaws: an inflated sense of self, a total disregard for boundaries, and an exhausting lack of maturity. Susanna Constantine, one of the most vocal voices in recent years, laid it out plainly. She called Andrew ignorant, entitled, a man who seemed utterly convinced the world owed him something just for existing. Her words weren't cruel, they were clear. They painted a picture of someone who had coasted through life unchecked, surrounded by yes-men and protected by the enormous cushion of royal privilege. She didn't just criticize his attitude. She questioned how he was ever allowed to attain things like a helicopter license. Not because he was unfit in a dramatic way, but because nothing about his demeanor ever reflected responsibility or discipline. The implication was sharp. Andrew didn't earn his way through anything. He was simply ushered through doors that others had to fight to open. That alone says a lot about the system he was raised in. But it's the stories from his earlier years, the ones that have resurfaced over and over, that truly lay the foundation for his downfall. Vicky Hodge, who dated Andrew in the 1980s, was among the first to voice concern, describing him as headstrong and prone to reckless behavior. At the time, it might have sounded like typical young royal antics. Now, it reads as foreshadowing. These weren't just teenage mistakes or awkward social missteps. They were red flags, and they were ignored. His behavior at social events, now widely discussed and reported, reveals something darker than just immaturity. Multiple witnesses have described humiliating pranks aimed at others, especially women. Accounts of him unzipping a woman's dress at a private party, shoving a guest's face into food, making lewd jokes with no regard for how uncomfortable he made others feel. It wasn't playful. It wasn't misunderstood. It was entitled and attention-seeking, and everyone knew it. And through it all, there was never remorse, no apology, no indication that he even recognized the damage or discomfort he caused. Instead, he seemed to feed off it. It was part of the performance. Being the brash one, the one who didn't care, the one who always got away with it. The truth is, Andrew operated for decades as though he were above consequence. Because for decades, he was protected by his title, covered by the institution, enabled by those around him who were more concerned with preserving the royal image than confronting the reality behind it. And the contrast between Andrew and his daughters only makes things more stark. Princess Beatrice and Princess Eugenie have managed to maintain a reputation for being respectful, grounded, and, above all, measured. They've handled their public lives with more grace than their father ever did. And that's not just by chance. That's proof that royalty doesn't have to mean arrogance. that the behavior Andrew displayed wasn't inevitable. The royal family, for all its tradition and ceremony, has always struggled with accountability, and Andrew's case exposed that tension in full force. For years, his behavior was tolerated, even protected. But once the Epstein scandal broke and the public backlash became unavoidable, the institution did what it always does under pressure. It acted, but too late. By the time Andrew's titles were stripped and his public duties revoked, the damage was already done. Not just to him, but to the reputation of the family as a whole. Because while the palace scrambled to contain the scandal, the public had already connected the dots. This wasn't a man suddenly caught in controversy. This was the same man people had been warning about for years. The 2019 interview only made things worse. Rather than taking accountability, Andrew deflected. Rather than showing empathy, he appeared confused as to why people were upset. The lack of self-awareness was staggering. And in that moment, whatever chance he had left to salvage his image disappeared completely. And still, the stories kept coming. More former insiders and romantic partners have stepped forward, not with salacious details, but with consistent character assessments, all pointing to the same core flaw: entitlement, a deep, unwavering belief that rules were for other people, that his royal status insulated him from the consequences of his actions, that whatever discomfort or harm he caused didn't really matter. And yet, here we are, Andrew stripped of his titles, removed from royal duties, and facing pressure to vacate royal residences. His fall from grace isn't just symbolic, it's substantive. His presence is no longer welcome in the same circles he once walked through without question. And the public? They're not forgetting anytime soon. This isn't just about Andrew anymore. It's about what his story represents. A reminder of how unchecked power, when left to fester, always finds its way into scandal. How privilege without accountability doesn't create strength, it creates delusion. And how systems that protect the powerful at the expense of the truth eventually crack under the weight of their own denial. Because the truth did come out, piece by piece, testimony by testimony. And what emerged was a deeply unflattering, but entirely consistent portrait of a man who never grew up, who never stopped believing he was the exception to every rule, and who, when finally faced with the consequences of his actions, didn't reflect. He resisted, and while he may no longer hold official titles, the impact of his actions lingers. His name now serves as a shorthand for royal scandal, for entitled downfall, for what happens when the system stops working in your favor and the consequences finally land. There's no soft landing here, no grand comeback waiting in the wings. Andrew's reputation is not recovering, it's been redefined, and it's not a flattering, so what now? That's up to the public. The palace has made its moves. The insiders have spoken. The story is out, but the conversation isn't over. If you've watched this far, we want to hear from you. Do you think Andrew's behavior was always destined to catch up with him? Should the royal family have acted sooner? How much of this is about one man, and how much is about the institution that protected him? Let us know what you think in the comments. Hit the like button if you believe power should come with accountability. Share this with someone who's been following the royal chaos. And subscribe for more breakdowns of the scandals I hope you'd never hear about, because this isn't the last royal reckoning. Not even close. By now, it's painfully clear Andrew Mountbatten Windsor didn't just slip into disgrace. He earned every step of it. Slowly, over the course of decades, through a steady stream of inappropriate behavior, juvenile stunts, and tone-deaf arrogance, he built a public image so toxic that not even the palace could salvage it. And the reason it's all come crashing down? Because the people who knew him best, the insiders, the former partners, the ones who had no PR agenda, are finally telling the truth. And that truth is brutal. We're talking about a man who, from a young age, acted like the rules simply didn't apply. From the very start, there was this unshakable confidence, not grounded in skill, not in intelligence or integrity, but in status. A last name, a title. That was all Andrew seemed to think he needed to get by. And for far too long, former girlfriends like Susanna Constantine have now gone on record, calling out the exact traits the public had long suspected but never fully confirmed. Ignorant, entitled, delusional enough to believe that the world owed him something. She didn't speak with bitterness. She spoke with clarity. with a kind of honest reflection that doesn't need embellishment because the facts speak for themselves. Then there's a question she raised, one that still makes people pause. How did he get that helicopter license? Not in the conspiracy theory way. In the, are we really pretending this man owned it way? Because when you put Andrew's history of immaturity and poor judgment next to the kind of discipline and seriousness required for something like that, the contrast is jarring. Constantine's point wasn't that it was illegal. It's that it was absurd. And that absurdity runs deep. Andrew's public persona for years was built on being the fun royal, the one who didn't take things too seriously, the one who partied, who traveled, who smiled for cameras and made cheeky jokes. But behind that image was a long history of behavior that crossed lines over and over again. Accounts from private parties describe a man who thrived on making others uncomfortable, pulling pranks that weren't funny, telling lewd jokes that no one laughed at, unzipping a woman's dress in public as some kind of punchline, shoving someone's face into their food. These aren't harmless anecdotes. They are glimpses into a personality that treated social settings like a stage for dominance, disguised as humor. It's not just bad taste. It's a pattern of humiliation for entertainment. And over time, that kind of behavior corrodes everything around it. Because when you act like that and never get called out for it, you don't stop. You escalate. You learn that boundaries are flexible if you have enough power. And eventually, you start to believe that nothing, not criticism, not scandal, not public outrage, can touch you. And for years, it didn't. Andrew coasted on that confidence for decades, even as red flags started stacking up, even as more and more insiders raised concerns, even as early partners like Vicky Hodge hinted at just how headstrong and self-absorbed he really was. The palace kept quiet. The press gave him a pass. And the man at the center of it all kept performing, oblivious to the damage he was causing. But what's more telling than any party story or awkward joke is a lack of remorse. Not once has Andrew shown meaningful reflection. Even after the Epstein connection erupted into full-blown scandal, even after he was forced to step down from public duties, there's been no sign that he truly understands the role he played in his own downfall. That 2019 interview was a disaster, not just because of what he said, but because of how he said it. Detached, defensive, baffled that people were upset. That moment revealed everything. This wasn't a man grappling with consequence. It was someone who had never had to. Meanwhile, his daughters, Beatrice and Eugenie, have quietly distanced themselves from the chaos. And the contrast is almost surreal. While Andrew doubled down on arrogance, they have embraced humility. While he became synonymous with scandal, they've leaned into charity work, private life, and measured appearances. It's not a perfect redemption arc, but it is a reminder that privilege doesn't have to breed ignorance. And it raises a much bigger question. How did they turn out so grounded while Andrew spiraled? The answer, again, points to choice. Because privilege isn't inherently corrupting. It's what you do with it. And in Andrew's case, he used it to elevate himself while diminishing everyone around him. Whether it was women at parties, colleagues, staff, or the public watching from the sidelines, he treated people like they were obstacles or props. Never equals. Never worthy of reflection. But now, that reflection is being forced onto him. Because the stories aren't stopping. The insiders aren't staying quiet. And the public? They're not forgiving. Every new account that surfaces only reinforces what's already clear. Andrew's fall wasn't a result of one catastrophic decision. It was a result of decades of unchecked behavior. Decades of entitlement. Decades of people looking the other way. And now, the palace has done what it always tries to do when a scandal becomes too big to contain. It's quietly erased him, stripped of titles, removed from royal duties, no longer allowed to represent the family in any official capacity. There's even pressure for him to vacate royal residences, an almost unthinkable prospect for someone born into that kind of institution. But it's not enough, because for many, the real issue isn't that Andrew fell. It's that he was allowed to rise so far without anyone stopping to ask if he should. And now, as the consequences finally land, we're left with a question the royal family still hasn't answered. How did it go on for this long? There's no tidy ending here. No speech. No grand gesture of repentance. Andrew has faded into the background, not with grace, but with silence. And in that silence, the damage lingers. because his name, once synonymous with royalty, now lives in the same breath as scandal, shame, and disgrace. That's a legacy. Not the parties, not the medals, not the photo ops. The legacy is arrogance left unchecked, privilege abused, consequences delayed until there was nothing left to salvage. And maybe that's what people are responding to. Not just the behavior, but the years of pretending it wasn't happening. The collective shrug that let Andrew believe he was untouchable. He wasn't. And now, everyone sees it. There's something uniquely unsettling about watching a public figure fall from grace, not because of a single scandal, but because of a long, slow accumulation of arrogance, bad behavior, and silence. That's what makes Andrew Mountbatten Windsor's story so infuriating, not just the behavior itself, but how long everyone pretended it wasn't happening. By the time the headlines caught up to him, the damage had already been done. And it wasn't just reputational. It was structural. The kind of damage that leaves a lasting dent in how people view not only the man himself, but the institution that allowed him to operate this way for so long. What we're seeing now is the aftermath. The dismantling of a public life that once seemed untouchable. He has been removed from official duties. His titles stripped. His presence at royal events is practically non-existent. And yet, there's still no real accountability. No apology. No moment of clarity or self-awareness. Just silence. Maybe some quiet bitterness. But no change. And it's not like there wasn't time to course-correct. People like Susanna Constantine were trying to wave the red flags long before Andrew became tabloid poison. Her comments were blunt, but not exaggerated. She called him out for what he was, entitled, out of touch, and fundamentally unaware of how his behavior affected the people around him. And while the world may have shrugged at those traits in the past, they don't feel harmless anymore. Then there's Vicky Hodge, who had her own warnings from way back in the 1980s. She spoke of Andrew's headstrong nature, his obsession with escapades, and his blatant disregard for boundaries. Looking back, her assessment doesn't read like an ex's grievance. It reads like a character study. She saw the trajectory clearly, even if the rest of the world chose to look away. But now, with each resurfaced story, each testimony, the trajectory has become impossible to deny. The thing that ties it all together isn't just immaturity or poor taste. It's entitlement. That sense that he was always going to be fine, no matter what he did. That the rules were flexible when it came to him. That there would always be someone to clean up the mess, to smooth over the fallout, to issue the carefully worded statement while Andrew went on with his life, unbothered. And for decades, that's exactly what happened. Which is why the public's patience didn't just run out, it collapsed. People don't want to hear carefully crafted palace statements anymore. They want honesty. And honesty means reckoning with the fact that this behavior wasn't a secret. It was just ignored. The stories from social events are enough to make your skin crawl. And they're not coming from tabloid fiction. They're coming from people who were there. The woman whose dress he unzipped. The guests who had their face shoved into food. The women who had to laugh off the crude comments just to get through the evening. This wasn't charm. It wasn't mischief. It was humiliation dressed up as personality. And Andrew? He seemed to love it, because in his world, reactions were currency. Shock value equaled attention, and attention meant relevance. He didn't need to be liked. He just needed to be the loudest voice in the room. That's what privilege does when it's never checked. It creates people who confuse notoriety with what's almost tragic is that Andrew's behavior didn't just damage his own reputation. It tainted the perception of the royal family as a whole. The institution that had tried so hard to modernize, to clean up its image, found itself stuck defending someone who represented everything people hate about inherited power. It was the exact opposite of the narrative they wanted, and they had no one to blame but themselves. Because let's be real, they knew, maybe not every detail, but they knew enough. They had heard the stories. They'd seen the behavior, and instead of stepping in, they looked away. Until they couldn't, and when the Epstein connection finally blew the lid off everything, that was it. The line had been crossed. The public wasn't just uncomfortable, they were outraged. Not just because of what Andrew had done, but because of how shamelessly he responded. That interview didn't just make him look guilty, it made him look clueless. Like a man so far removed from reality that he thought he could charm his way out of a global scandal. Spoiler, he couldn't. What followed was a rapid and very public fall. Titles stripped, roles removed. A man who had once moved freely through royal corridors was suddenly persona non grata, not because he'd changed, but because the world had finally caught up to him. And yet, even now, the consequences feel incomplete. He may have lost the trappings of his status, but is still insulated, still living on royal property, still benefiting from the very system he abused. That's what keeps this story alive. The unfinished nature of it. The fact that for so many people, justice still feels like a distant concept. Because it's not just about punishing one man, it's about dismantling the structure that allowed him to flourish unchecked for so long. That's the real reckoning. And it hasn't fully happened. Meanwhile, his daughters continue to walk the fine line of loyalty and self-preservation. They haven't thrown him under the bus, but they've also avoided defending him publicly. It's a delicate balance. And frankly, it's probably the only reason their reputations remain intact. Because they've stayed quiet, out of the spotlight, focused on their own work and lives, and not trying to justify the unjustifiable. It's telling that they've been able to navigate this minefield with more maturity than Andrew ever showed in his public life. And that's what it comes down to: maturity, accountability, awareness, all the things Andrew lacked, even when it was clear he needed them most. His story isn't a tragedy in the traditional sense. There's no heroic rise and fall, no noble sacrifice. It's a cautionary tale, a very public reminder of what happens when someone believes they are above consequence for too long. When bad behavior is enabled instead of corrected. When status is mistaken for character. So here we are. Andrew is out. His name is a punchline. His future as a public figure is non-existent. And the royal family is still trying to figure out how to clean up the mess he left behind. But for the rest of us, it's not just gossip. It's a lesson in how power operates, in what happens when silence replaces accountability, and in the kind of entitlement that doesn't just hurt reputations, it erodes public trust. If you've made it this far, let us know what you think. Was this downfall avoidable? Did the institution fail, or was this always a path Andrew was on? Drop your thoughts in the comments. Share this with someone who's been following the saga, and hit that like button if you think real accountability shouldn't take decades. Subscribe for more deep dives into the scandals, cover-ups, and PR disasters they never wanted you to remember. Because we're just